The clock shows 11:16 at night on March 4th, 1944. At Sing Sing Prison, the room where executions happen is silent, except for the quiet buzzing of electrical machines being checked one last time. In a small cell nearby, a man waits peacefully. He is wearing the simple clothes given to prisoners, with one leg of his pants cut higher to allow for a metal plate. His name is Lepke Buchalter, but the world knows him by a different name. Lep, he is 47 years old. He has been a husband, a stepfather, and for almost 20 years, one of the most important crime leaders in American history. Tonight, he will become something completely different. He will be the only big organized crime boss ever put to death by the United States government. The guards come for him at 11:20 p. He walks firmly on his own. He does not fight back in a few minutes. He will sit in the electric chair, and 2,000 volts of electricity will move through his body. But before we see that last moment, we need to learn how a poor Jewish immigrant boy from Manhattan's Lower East Side became the man that even the famous gangster Lucky Luciano was afraid of. The man who built a giant criminal business using fear, who commanded more than 80 killings with the cold planning of a business manager, who controlled the most important parts of American business through force and threats. This is the story of Lepke Buchalter, and it starts not with his death, but with his birth in a packed apartment building on a chilly February day in 1897. Before we go deep into this amazing true story, I want to know what you think. Leave a comment below and tell me, where are you watching this from? And what time is it right now? Are you getting ready for bed with this story? Are you beginning your day with some dark history? If you love deep stories about gangster history like this one, press that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss these long documentaries. Give this video a like if you are ready for the full hidden story of Lep. Believe me, this is a trip worth making. Now, let us start. On February 6, 1897, in a crowded apartment on Manhattan's Lower East Side, Rose Buchalter had her second son. She called him Louis, but to her, he would always be Lepke. Little Louis in Yiddish. The cute name would stay. It was made shorter finally to Lep, and with that name, he would become both scared of and famous. The Lower East Side in 1897 was its own world. A busy, needy, lively place where more than 500,000 immigrants, mostly Jewish and Italian people, were packed into just over 1 square mile of Manhattan. People said you could walk the streets and hear 10 different languages, smell food from 3 continents, and see both the best and worst of how people can act, all on one city block. The Buchalter family was part of this huge wave of people coming to America. Louis's father, Barnett Buchalter, had been a widower when he left progeny in what is now Belarus. Coming to America in 1890 with 3 daughters from his first marriage, he was a good machinist who ran a small hardware store, giving a simple but honest life for his family. Louis's mother, Rose Buchalter, had come from Vilnius with 3 sons and 2 daughters from her own first marriage. When Barnett and Rose married in 1893, they brought together a family that would finally have 13 children. Young Louis was born into this big combined home. Even with the poor conditions and crowding that marked immigrant life, the Buchalter children were told to follow education and good behavior. His half-brother Charles Coven would become a rabbi. His brother Emmanuel became a dentist. His brother Isidore became a pharmacist. By all stories, the Buchalter home valued learning, hard work, and the American dream. Louis himself showed he could be a good student. He went to the Rabbi Jacob Joseph School on the Lower East Side, where he made the honor roll. His teacher saw that he was quiet, watchful, and smart. He seemed to learn information very quickly, and he was especially good at mathematics and solving problems. Nothing in his early years pointed to the dark road he would finally take. But in 1909, when Louis was only 12 years old, everything became different. Baronet Buchalter died, leaving Rose to take care of a house full of children by herself. The family's small amount of money was gone almost immediately. Rose, who had been in bad health for years, fought to keep the family fed and with a home. The stress was huge in 1910, facing a situation that seemed impossible. Rose made the very sad choice that thousands of immigrant mothers had made before her. She would send Louis to live with his older sister, Sarah, who had married and moved to Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Maybe Sarah and her husband could give the steadiness and guidance that Rose could not give anymore. Maybe Louis would have better chances away from the growing hopelessness at home. Whatever Rose's hopes were, the separation would turn out to be very important. Rose herself, looking for help for her lung sickness, would finally move to Arizona, leaving Louis basically without parents at age 13. Years later, when Lepke had become one of the most powerful gangsters in America, he would tell friends that his mother leaving was the most important moment of his childhood, the moment when he learned he could depend on no one but himself. Williamsburg in 1910 was, if anything, even tougher in the Lower East Side. The area was a battlefield where Irish, Italian, and Jewish gangs fought for territory and control. Young Louis found himself in a world where living depended not on honor roll grades, but on street wisdom, strength, and the ability to fight. He was small for his age. He would finally grow to only 5 feet 7.5 inches. And at first, this made him a target. But Louis learned fast. He learned how to talk his way out of a problem, how to understand people, how to feel danger. And when talking did not work, he learned how to fight in a mean way to win by any method needed. More importantly, he learned the money rules of the street. In Williamsburg, like on the Lower East Side, a whole hidden economy was strong. Pushcart sellers paid protection money to local tough guys. Small businesses paid for insurance against fires and damage that everyone knew would be done by the same people collecting the insurance money. Gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, all of it worked openly. With the quiet okay from police who were themselves taking bribes, young Louis watched and learned. He saw that the men who did well were not always the strongest or the most violent. They were the smartest, the most organized, the ones who understood that crime was a business. Violence was just a tool, and like any tool, it worked best when used exactly and with a plan. His first arrest came in the fall of 1915. Just after his 18th birthday, he was caught breaking into an apartment. The charges were finally dropped, but it was a warning sign. Louis Buchalter was no longer heading toward the respectable middle-class life his family had imagined. He was heading somewhere much darker. Louis's second problem with the law was more serious. In 1917, he was arrested again for burglary, and this time the charges stuck. He was found guilty and sentenced to Sing Sing, the same prison where many years later he would meet his end. For many young criminals, prison is a school for crime, and for Louis, Sing Sing was a life-changing place. He was young, small, and new to the system, which should have made him an easy target. But Louis had something that kept him safe his mind. He was smart, watchful, and most importantly, he knew how to listen. In Sing Sing, Louis made connections with more experienced criminals. He learned about the organization of crime in New York, how different gangs controlled different areas and different illegal businesses, how the police and politicians were bought and paid for, how the real money was not in simple burglary or robbery, but in planned, organized crime. Most importantly, at Sing Sing, Louis met the man who would become his lifelong partner, Jacob Gora Shapiro. Where Louis was small, quiet, and thoughtful, Gora was large, loud, and physical. He got his nickname from his habit of snarling "Gora, out of here" at anyone who bothered him. He was a natural enforcer, a man who liked scaring people and violence in ways that Louis never did. But the two men completed each other perfectly. Louis gave the brains and the strategy. Gora gave the muscle and the threatening look. Together, they would make one of the most successful crime partnerships of the time. Louis was let out in 1919, having served about a year and a half. He was 22 years old, and any dreams of a normal life had long since disappeared. His mother was far away in Arizona. His brothers and sisters had moved on with their respectable jobs. Louis had found a different path and a different kind of family, the brotherhood of thieves and killers that ruled New York's underworld. When Louis came out from Sing Sing, America was in the middle of the First World War and New York City was booming. The war economy had made jobs and wealth, but it had also made a chance for criminals. With so many young men overseas, policing was thin, illegal markets did well, and in the immigrant neighborhoods, where being poor remained common even with the general wealth, the attraction of easy money was too strong to resist. Louis and Gora started small. As most young criminals did, they robbed pushcarts, an old tradition among Lower East Side tough guys. The usual job was simple. Two men would walk up to a pushcart seller, usually an older immigrant, selling vegetables or dry goods, and demand money. If the seller said no, the cart would be turned over, the goods thrown in the street. Most sellers paid rather than face being bothered again and again. But Louis understood that this was small-time stuff. The real money, he realized, was in the labor movement. The years after World War I saw a huge growth in union organizing, especially in New York's giant clothing industry. Hundreds of thousands of workers, mostly Jewish and Italian immigrants, mostly women, worked in sweatshops for very low pay under dangerous conditions. The unions promised to organize these workers, to fight for better pay and safer conditions, to give them a voice. But the unions also meant a huge chance for criminals. A union strike could close entire factories, costing owners thousands of dollars a day. A union's pension fund could hold hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. And union elections could be fixed, letting the right people control these powerful groups. Louis and Gora saw all of this very clearly. They understood that whoever controlled the unions could control the whole industry. They could force the owners to pay by threatening strikes. They could steal from the workers by taking union funds. And they could put themselves in the middle, taking a part of everything that moved through the clothing district. All they needed was a way in, and chance, as it so often does, came knocking in the early 1920s. The main person in Lower East Side labor racketeering was a gangster named Jacob Little Augie Organ. Even with his nickname, he was only 5 feet 3 inches tall. Organ was a strong figure. He controlled several unions and had a small army of enforcers under his command. He was making good money, and he was always looking for smart, reliable men to join his operation. Louis and Gora caught Organ's attention through a mix of skill and cruelty. In a world full of thugs and brutes, Louis stood out for his intelligence and his ability to think with a strategy. He did not just break heads. He understood the business angles, the points of pressure, the ways to make the most money while lowering the risk. Organ brought the pair into his group. and Louis proved to be a fast learner. He learned how labor racketeering really worked. You went to a factory owner and explained that his workers were unhappy, that they might strike, that a strike could cost him thousands of dollars and ruin his relationships with his customers. But for a fair fee, you could make sure the strike did not happen. You could keep his workers in line. You could promise labor peace, of course. You also went to the union leaders and explained that they needed protection. Protection from rival unions, protection from gangsters who might threaten them, protection from their own members who might vote them out. For a fair fee, you could give that protection. And you took money from the union pension funds carefully. Not so much that it would be noticed right away, but enough to add up to real money over time. It was, Louis realized, a beautiful system. You collected money from both sides, from the owners and from the unions. You used the threat of violence, but rarely had to actually do it. And you wrapped it all in a cover of seeming legal. You were not a criminal. You were a labor consultant. A fixer, a problem solver. By 1925, Louis and Gura were making serious money. They had their own crew of enforcers. They controlled several small unions. They were no longer street punks robbing pushcarts. They were becoming real power brokers in the clothing district. But Louis had bigger dreams. He looked at little Augie Organ and saw a man who was limited in his vision, who was happy to keep his current illegal businesses rather than growing. Louis understood that the real chance was in taking over whole industries, in becoming so set in the economic fabric of New York that it would be impossible to pull him out. And Louis was willing to do whatever was needed to reach that goal, including, if needed, removing little Augie Organ from the picture. On October 15th, 1927, little Augie Organ left his girlfriend's apartment on Norfolk Street on the Lower East Side. It was evening, and the streets were full of people. Walking with Organ was his bodyguard, Jack Legs Diamond, himself a feared gangster who would later become famous on his own. As the two men walked down the street, 3 men came out from the shadows. Guns were pulled. Shots were fired. Little Augie fell to the ground, dead almost at once. Diamond was also hit but lived, though he refused to name the shooters to police. The police investigation quickly focused on Louis Lepke Buchalter and Gora Shapiro. People had seen them in the area. Word on the street was that there had been a fight between Organ and Lepp over how to handle a clothing worker strike. Organ wanted to settle the strike for a one-time payment of $50,000. Lepp wanted the strike to continue so the payments would keep coming. More basically, Lepp and Gura wanted to take over Organ's operation. And in the world they lived in, there was only one sure way to do that. Lepp and Gura were arrested and charged with Organ's murder. But even with the police suspicions, there was no physical proof linking them to the crime. Legs Diamond, the only witness who could have named the shooters, refused to talk. Other possible witnesses suddenly could not remember or left town. The charges were dropped. Lepp and Gura walked free, and they took over little Augie Organ's illegal businesses. The lesson was clear to everyone in the underworld. Lepke Buchalter was not a man to be thought little of. He might be small and quiet, but he was completely ruthless. He would kill anyone who stood in his way, and he was smart enough to get away with it. With little Augie Organ gone, Lepp and Gura moved fast to make their control over the clothing district solid. They took over the unions that Organ had controlled. They moved into new territories, and they made perfect the system that would make them millions. The clothing industry in 1920s New York was huge, using hundreds of thousands of workers in thousands of factories spread across Manhattan and Brooklyn. It made everything from cheap dresses to expensive suits. From children's clothes to women's undergarments, the industry made hundreds of millions of dollars in money every year. And Lep meant to take his cut of all of it. His method was simple in its cleverness. Through a mix of bribery, threats, and planned killings, Lep got control of the key unions in the clothing industry: the Amalgamated Clothing Workers, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, and several smaller trade unions. Once he controlled the unions, he controlled the workers. And once he controlled the workers, he could shut down any factory in New York with a word. Factory owners quickly learned that it was cheaper to pay Lep than to fight him. A strike could cost thousands of dollars a day in lost production, not to mention the loss of contracts and reputation. For a small part of that amount, paid regularly to Lep's organization, labor peace was promised, but Lep did not stop there. He also took control of the trucking companies that moved finished clothes from the factories to the stores. If a factory owner refused to pay, his trucks would be stolen, his goods would disappear, his deliveries would be late. Again, it was cheaper to pay than to fight. The system was so good that Lep finally did something amazing. He basically made the clothing industry steady by controlling both labor and transportation. He could stop damaging price wars between makers, could make sure of fairly regular pay for workers, and could manage the whole industry to everyone's benefit, as long as everyone paid their share to Lep. It was, in a twisted way, a form of industrial organization. Lep was providing a service, lowering chaos, giving predictability, solving arguments. The fact that he was doing it through violence and forcing people to pay did not change the money reality. People were willing to pay for what he offered. By 1930, law enforcement thought that Lep and Gora were making over $1 million per year from their clothing industry illegal businesses alone. In today's dollars, that would be equal to over $20 million every year. And the clothing industry was just the start. Lep understood a rule that legal businessmen also understood. Having different kinds of income lowers risk. If you depend on a single source of money, you are in danger. But if you have many money streams, you are much more secure. So Lep grew beyond the clothing industry. He moved into the trucking business more widely, taking control of several major hauling companies and using them to force payments from businesses all over New York. He moved into the baking industry, charging bakeries 1 penny for each loaf of bread to deliver their bread to market. A tiny amount per loaf, but multiplied by millions of loaves. It added up to huge sums. He moved into the fur industry, the handbag industry, the leather industry. Everywhere he went, the pattern was the same. Get control of the unions, control the trucking, offer protection, and collect payments from everyone. It was systematic, organized, and very profitable. But Lep's success got the attention of other gangsters, and in the early 1930s, New York's underworld was going through a violent change that would change organized crime forever. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Italian-American Mafia in New York was torn apart by a mean fight for power called the Castellamarese War. On one side was Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masseria, an old-line Sicilian boss who controlled much of lower Manhattan. On the other side was Salvatore Maranzano, a newer arrival who represented the interests of Sicilian gangsters from the town of Castellammare del Golfo. The war was brutal, with dozens of men killed on both sides. But what came out of the fight would change American organized crime. A group of younger gangsters. Men like Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel looked at the old Sicilian bosses and saw dinosaurs. These young men had grown up in America. They understood American business methods, and they believed that the old, ethnic fights and tough guy acting of the Sicilian Mafia were not efficient and self-destructive. They imagined something different. A national crime group organized along company lines where different ethnic groups, Italians, Jews, Irish, would work together for shared profit. Territories would be divided. Fights would be settled through talking rather than violence. Rules would be made and followed. Before going forward, if you are enjoying the video, press the like button and leave a comment. Also, a quick reminder, a false channel is stealing my content and changing the pictures to trick you. The original and earliest upload is always here. Thank you for watching on the real channel. In 1931, this vision began to take shape. With the support of Luciano and others, Joe Masiria was killed in a Coney Island restaurant. Maranzano briefly took control, calling himself the boss of all bosses. But he too was soon killed, taken out by killers sent by the younger group. From the chaos, a new structure appeared, the Commission. It was, in effect, a board of directors for organized crime. The most powerful bosses, representing the major families in New York and other cities, would sit on the commission and make choices affecting the whole underworld. Fights would be judged. Big decisions, like killing a boss, would need commission okay. And above all, the commission would work to make violence as little as possible and make profit as big as possible. Lepke Buchalter was asked to join this new group. His skill in labor racketeering was too valuable to ignore, and his intelligence and organizational skills made him a natural fit for the commission's company-like way of doing crime. Working within this new group structure, Lepke became one of the most powerful gangsters in America. He was the commission's expert on labor racketeering. When other bosses had union problems, they came to Lepke. When they needed advice on how to get into a new industry, they came to Lepke. And when they needed something else, something much darker, they also came to Lepke. Because in addition to his regular crime businesses, Lepke was about to make something truly terrible, America's first professional murder-for-hire organization. The idea behind Murder, Inc. was simple but new. In the old days, when a gangster wanted someone killed, he would either do it himself or use members of his own crew. This made several problems. First, it made proof linking the boss to the murder. Second, it meant that people who saw it might recognize the killers. Third, it meant that the killers might later be arrested and might talk to save themselves. Lepke, along with other commission members like Albert Anastasia and Meyer Lansky, thought of a better system. They would make a crew of professional killers who would work for the commission as a whole, not for any single boss. When someone needed to be killed, the request would go through the right steps. If okayed, the job would be given to killers who had no personal link to the victim and no reason to kill him except that it was their job. The killers would be brought in mainly from the tough Jewish and Italian neighborhoods of Brooklyn, places like Brownsville and Ocean Hill, where poverty and violence had made a group of young men who were willing to kill for money and who saw it as just another job. The main office of this organization was a normal-looking place, a 24-hour candy store called Midnight Roses, at the corner of Saratoga and Livonia Avenues in Brownsville. The store was owned by an older Jewish woman named Rose Gold, who may or may not have fully understood what was happening in her business. Along the back wall, she kept a line of payphones. Members of the crew would hang around the store playing cards, drinking egg creams, and waiting for one of the phones to ring with a new job. The list of killers included some of the most cruel men in American criminal history. Abe Kid Twist Reels, a brutal killer with a memory like a photograph, who liked murder. and who would later become the most damaging teller in mob history. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, maybe the most productive killer in murder, Inc., thought to have done maybe 100 murders himself. He was careful, professional, and completely without a heart. Martin Bugsy Goldstein, Riley's childhood friend and partner in many murders. He and Reels basically ran the Brownsville crew. Harry Happy Maione, despite his cheerful nickname. Maione was a stone-cold killer who was good at making bodies disappear. Ali Tick-Tock Tannenbaum, a killer who also worked as a driver and planner for hits. Seymour Blue Jaw Magoon, another driver and support player in many murders. On the Italian side, the crew included Louis Capone, no relation to Al Capone, Frank Dasher Abendondo, and others who worked under the direct watch of Albert Anastasia, who got the nickname Lord High Executioner. For his part in the organization, the system worked like this. When a commission member decided someone needed to die, maybe an informant, maybe a rival, maybe someone who had broken the rules, the request would be sent to the commission for okay. If okayed, the job would go to Albert Anastasia, who would give it to the right killers. The killers would get a fee, anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000, a big sum in the 1930s, along with a regular salary just for being available. The killers would study their target, decide the best method and time for the hit, and then do it. The murders were professional, efficient, and very different. Some victims were shot, others strangled, others stabbed. Some were killed in their homes, others on the street, others in restaurants or hotels. Bodies were sometimes left in place, sometimes dumped in faraway places, sometimes buried where they would never be found. Between 1929 and 1941, Murder, Inc. is thought to have done between 400 and 1,000 contract killings. The exact number will never be known, because many bodies were never found, and many murders were never connected to the organization. Lep himself was one of the main users of Murder, Inc., as he built his labor racketeering empire. He faced constant threats, union officials who would not work with him, business owners who would not pay, possible informants who might talk to law enforcement. Lep's solution was simple: kill them. But Lep was careful, very careful. He almost never gave murder orders straight to the killers themselves. Instead, he would tell one of his lieutenants, men like Mendy Weiss or Louis Capone, that someone was causing problems. The lieutenant would pass the order down the line. The actual killers often did not even know who had ordered the hit, only that it was a commission job. This system of protection would keep Lep safe for years. But in the end, it would fail because of one moment of carelessness, one burst of anger, one heard conversation. Through the early 1930s, Lep's power grew. He controlled industries. He had politicians on his payroll. He had judges and police officers taking his money. He lived in a fancy apartment overlooking Central Park with his wife Betty Wasserman, a British-born woman of Russian Jewish background, whom he had married in 1931, and her son Harold from a past marriage, whom Lep adopted even with his crime activities. Lep kept an outside appearance of respectability. He dressed in a plain way, in well-made suits. He rarely raised his voice. He went to his stepson's bar mitzvah, an event also attended by Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, and Albert Anastasia, among other famous gangsters. He took his family on vacations to Europe, to outsiders. He might have been a successful businessman, but under this cover of respectability, Lep was ruling an empire of violence. His men called him the Judge, or Judge Louis, because he decided who lived and who died. When Lepke spoke, men died. And in the clothing district, the trucking industry, and everywhere else that Lepke's influence reached, everyone understood what would happen if they crossed him. Think about the case of Morris Diamond, a labor organizer who tried to fight Lepke's control of the clothing workers' unions. Diamond was warned to stop. He refused. He believed that if he went public with what he knew about Lepke's corruption, the authorities would have to act. He was wrong. On a warm summer evening in 1931, Morris Diamond was walking home from a union meeting. Two men came up to him from behind. The first bullet hit him in the back of the head. He was dead before he hit the ground. The killers walked calmly away. No one was ever arrested for the murder. Or think about Peter Enzilo, a union official who had stolen money from one of the unions that Lepke controlled. In the normal way of business, Lepke might have simply asked for the money back. But Enzilo had made the deadly mistake of talking about Lepke's operation to people outside the organization. That made him not just a thief, but a possible informant. Enzilo was found in his car, parked on a quiet Brooklyn street, with 5 bullets in his head. Again, no arrests were made. The message to anyone in Lepke's circle was clear. You do not steal from Lepke. You do not challenge Lepke. And above all, you do not talk about Lepke to anyone, especially not to the police. Breaking these rules had only one punishment: death. By 1935, law enforcement thought that Lepke and Gura had 250 men working for them, directly with hundreds more who could be called when needed. They were making well over $1 million per year. And that was just from the operations that authorities knew about. The real number was likely much higher. Lepke had done something amazing. He had basically become his own government within his area of influence. He taxed businesses. He settled fights. He enforced his own laws with his own police force. And like any government, he kept power through a mix of seeming okay, the services he gave, and fear, the violence he could use. But in 1935, 2 things happened that would start Lepke's fall. First, the commission made a choice to kill one of their own, a move that would bring law enforcement attention to organized crime like never before. And second, a young lawyer named Thomas Dewey was picked to clean up corruption in New York City, and he aimed to destroy the mob. Dutch Schultz was a problem. Born Arthur Flegenheimer, he ran the Bronx. Schultz had built his own crime empire based on bootlegging during Prohibition, and after it ended on the numbers racket, an illegal lottery in African-American neighborhoods. He was unstable, violent, and more paranoid. By 1935, Schultz had gotten the attention of Thomas Dewey, who was set to take him to court for not paying taxes. Schultz had already beaten one set of charges by moving his trial to a country area upstate, where the jury felt sorry for his claim of government picking on him. But Dewey did not give up, and Schultz knew that he could not get lucky twice. Schultz's answer to his problem was simple: kill Thomas Dewey. He brought the idea to a commission meeting. His plan was straightforward. He had studied Dewey's daily routine and had found a weak spot every morning. Dewey stopped at a drugstore near his apartment to make a phone call while his bodyguards waited outside. Schultz would have a killer waiting in the drugstore. When Dewey went into the phone booth, the killer would shoot him through the glass, then kill the druggist as a witness and walk out past the bodyguards, who would never know what had happened until it was too late. The commission members were horrified. Lepke spoke up right away. "We will all burn if Dewey is knocked off. The heat will be unbearable." Lucky Luciano agreed. Killing a lawyer would bring the full weight of law enforcement on organized crime. Every cop in New York would be out for blood. The federal people would get involved. Politicians who had been willing to look the other way would have no choice but to crack down. It would be a disaster. Schultz was furious. He called the other commission members cowards. He said he would kill Dewey with or without their okay. The commission took a vote. The choice was everyone agreed. Dutch Schultz had to die on October 23, 1935. Schultz was eating at the Palace Chop House in Newark, New Jersey, with 3 of his top helpers. A team of killers, including Charles the Bug Workman and Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, entered the restaurant. They found Schultz in the men's room and shot him in the stomach. They then killed his 3 helpers in the dining room. Schultz lived for 22 more hours before dying in the hospital. The strange part was that Schultz's murder probably saved Thomas Dewey's life. But it also marked a turning point. The commission had shown it was willing to kill one of its own to keep order. And Thomas Dewey, now knowing that he had been aimed at for killing, became more set than ever to destroy organized crime in New York. Thomas Edmund Dewey was 33 years old when he was made special lawyer in 1935, but he had already made a name as an honest and brilliant attorney. Born in Michigan, educated at Columbia Law School, Dewey had the kind of clean-cut, all-American look that made him seem more like a movie star than a lawyer. Indeed, with his perfectly trimmed mustache and his perfect suits, he could have been in a Hollywood film as the hero who brings down the gangsters. But under the polished outside was a man of fierce want and complete belief. Dewey believed that organized crime had corrupted New York to its center, that gangsters like Lepke and Luciano had basically bought entire police stations, that judges were taking bribes, and that politicians were in the mob's pocket. He believed that organized crime was not just a law enforcement problem, but a real danger to democratic government, and he was set to dig it out. Governor Herbert Lehman gave Dewey special powers. He could look into anyone, could call grand juries, could offer safety to witnesses, and had a budget big enough to hire a staff of young, aggressive lawyers who shared his vision. Dewey put together what was basically an elite strike force against the mob. His first big target was Lucky Luciano, and in 1936, Dewey successfully took Luciano to court for running a prostitution ring, a charge that seems almost small given Luciano's actual crime businesses, but which was enough to send him to prison for 30 to 50 years. The message was clear. Dewey could get anyone. With Luciano behind bars, Dewey turned his attention to the labor racketeers. And that meant Louis Buchalter and Gora Shapiro. Dewey's look into Lep started with the basics, following the money and turning witnesses. He called for bank records, looked at union money statements, and talked with hundreds of clothing district workers and business owners. Many were terrified to talk, knowing that working with Dewey could mean death from Lep's organization. But Dewey offered protection, and more importantly, he offered hope that Lep could actually be brought down. Slowly, witnesses began to come forward. A factory owner said in court that he had been paying Lep $50 per week for years to avoid labor trouble. A union official admitted that he had been put in his position by Lep and gave back a part of all union funds to Lep's organization. A truck driver described how he had been forced to join a union controlled by Lep and had to pay dues that went straight into Lep's pocket. None of this, speaking by itself, was enough to put Lep away for life. But it built a case, and as the case built, Lep became more and more aware that Dewey was serious. In 1937, Dewey brought charges against Lep and Gora on counts of labor racketeering and forcing payments in the baking and flour trucking industries. The charges could mean sentences of up to 25 years. For the first time in his crime career, Lep faced the real chance of spending the rest of his life in prison. At the same time, federal authorities were building their own case against Lep. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover was looking into Lepp for drug trafficking. Lepp had moved into the drug business in the mid-1930s, bringing heroin from Europe and giving it out through his network in New York. The federal charges, if proven, could add decades to any sentence Lepp might get from Dewey. Lepp talked with his lawyers. The legal advice was bad. If he went to trial, he would likely be found guilty on at least some of the charges. His best choice might be to work out a deal, serve some time, and hope to start his operations again later. But Lepp had another choice: run. In the fall of 1937, as the charges were being prepared, Lepke Buchalter disappeared. He simply vanished from his apartment, from his usual places. From the face of the earth, his wife, Betty, said she did not know where he was. His friends refused to talk. One day Lepp was there. The next day he was gone. Gora Shapiro tried to run too, but he was not as careful as Lepp. He was arrested in early 1938 while hiding in a hotel in upstate New York. Faced with huge proof and with no hope of Lepp coming to help him, Gora agreed to say he was guilty to some of the charges. He was sentenced to life in prison for forcing payments. He would die in Sing Sing prison in 1947. His health broken by years in prison, but Lepp stayed free. And his disappearing started the biggest manhunt in American history up to that point. Thomas Dewey put a $25,000 reward on Lepp's head, a huge sum equal to nearly $500,000 today. The FBI added another $25,000, making it a $50,000 reward in total. J. Edgar Hoover, who had a feel for publicity, called Lepp Public Enemy Number 1, the first time that special name had been used since the death of John Dillinger in 1934. Wanted posters appeared across the country. Lepp's photograph was in every newspaper. Police raids aimed at dozens of places where he might be hiding. Known friends were arrested and questioned. The pressure on organized crime in general, and on anyone who might be hiding Lepp, became intense. And yet, Lepp stayed hidden for more than 2 years. He lived as a runaway, moving from safe house to safe house, never staying in one place for more than a few days, always just one step ahead of the law. But being a runaway presented Lepp with a problem. He could not run his crime empire while in hiding. His orders had to be passed through go-betweens. He could not meet with friends face to face. Money that was owed to him piled up in the hands of others. His power, which had been total, began to wear away. Worse, his runaway status was causing problems for the whole crime group. Police were raiding mob places all over New York, supposedly looking for Lepp, but really just adding pressure. Politicians who had been friendly to organized crime were now afraid to help, terrified that any link to the mob would connect them to the famous runaway. The heat, as Lepp himself had guessed when arguing against killing Dutch Schultz, was unbearable. The commission began to have quiet talks about what to do about Lepke Buchalter. Where was Lepp during those 2 years? The answer, amazingly, was that he was hiding almost in plain sight, or at least close to it. He was in Brooklyn in a series of apartments controlled by Albert Anastasia. Anastasia, Lepp's partner in Murder, Inc., stayed loyal lower than most. He understood that Lepp knew too much about too many murders, and that if Lepp were caught and decided to talk, it could bring down the whole organization. So, Anastasia gave safe houses and protection, moving Lepp from one apartment to another, always keeping him ahead of the FBI. But it was a terrible way to live. Lepp, who had once lived in luxury, who had eaten at fine restaurants and vacationed in Europe, was now kept in small, dirty apartments. He could not go outside for fear of being recognized. He could not contact his wife except through tricky systems of go-betweens. He could not run his businesses. He was a prisoner of his own success. During this time, Lep made a choice that would finally decide his fate. He decided to kill anyone who might be able to say in court against him. If he was finally going to be caught, and he was starting to realize that might be sure to happen, he wanted to make sure that the lawyers would have no witnesses. The order went out. Anyone who could connect Lep to specific crimes had to die. What followed was a killing time that would shock even the hardened criminals of murder. Inc. Over the next 2 years, dozens of men were murdered, small-time criminals. Truck drivers, union officials, anyone who might have information about Lep's operations. Among the victims, William Snyder, a clothing trucker who had been an informant. Hyman Yoron, who had stolen from one of Lep's unions. Irving Penn, a clothing district businessman who had talked to investigators. Albert Pluggy Schumann, a union official who knew too much. The killings were careful and brutal. Bodies turned up in alleyways, in car trunks, dumped in the rivers around New York. The police and the FBI knew that Lep was behind the murders, but they could not prove it because the only people who could have spoken in court were dead. But Lep made one important wrong guess. He assumed that all possible witnesses could be found and killed. He was wrong. There was one man who could connect Lep to a specific murder, and Lep did not know this man existed. His name was Max Rubin, and he would finally become the key to Lep's being found guilty and executed. To understand why Lep finally sat in the electric chair, we need to go back to September 13th, 1936, and to a small candy store at 725 Sutter Avenue in the Brownsville part of Brooklyn. The store was owned by Joseph Rosen, a 43-year-old man with a wife and 4 children. Rosen was not a gangster. He was not involved in organized crime. He was simply a man trying to make a living, but Joseph Rosen had once been a truck driver in the clothing district. And that meant he had crossed paths with Lep's world. In the early 1930s, Rosen had run a small trucking business, moving clothes from factories to stores. It was a small operation, just a couple of trucks, but it gave a decent living for his family. Then Lep's organization moved to take control over all clothing trucking in New York. Rosen was told he had to either join Lep's trucking group and pay money or get out of the business completely. Rosen refused at first. He had built his business through hard work, and he did not want to give it up. But Lep's men were persuasive. Rosen's trucks were damaged. His tires were cut. He got threats, finally seeing he had no choice. Rosen sold his trucks and tried to find other work, but finding work was not easy. Rosen struggled, his family struggled, and Rosen grew bitter. He began talking to his friends, to his family, to anyone who would listen about how Lepke Buchalter had destroyed his business. He talked about the forced payments, the threats, the forced joining of the trucking industry. Word of this got back to Lep, and Lep, always careful about possible informants, saw Rosen as a threat. If Thomas Dewey ever heard about Rosen's story, he might call Rosen to speak in court. Rosen could describe the forced payment illegal business in detail. He could give direct speaking about how Lep's organization worked. Lep made a choice. Joseph Rosen had to die. The job was given to Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone, 2 of Lep's most trusted lieutenants. They in turn brought in several members of Murder, Inc. to do the actual killing Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, and several others. On the morning of September 13th, 1936, the killers waited outside Rosen's candy store. They knew his routine. He arrived at the store early each morning to get ready for the day's business. As Rosen unlocked the door and stepped inside, the killers followed, 17 shots were fired. Joseph Rosen was hit many times, the bullets tearing through his body. He died on the floor of his own store, surrounded by candy and newspapers, and the small stock of a small businessman trying to make an honest living. The killers left calmly, walking to a waiting car. Within minutes, they were gone. The police look into it went nowhere at first. The neighborhood of Brownsville had a strict rule of silence when it came to mob murders. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The case grew cold. But there had been a witness that Lep did not know about. On the morning of the murder, a clothing industry businessman named Max Rubin had been meeting with Rosen, trying to help him find work. Rubin had left the store just minutes before the killers arrived. As he walked down the street, he heard the shots. He turned back and saw the killers leaving the store. He did not see their faces clearly, but he saw enough. And importantly, Rubin knew why Rosen had been killed before the murder. Rosen had talked to Rubin about his problems with Lep, about how he was afraid but did not know what to do after the murder. Rubin understood right away what had happened and why. Rubin was terrified. If the killers knew that he had been there, that he could connect the murder to Lep, he would be next. So, Rubin kept silent. He told the police he knew nothing. He tried to forget what he had seen. But Max Rubin would not stay silent forever, and his speaking in court would finally send Lepke Buchalter to the electric chair. By the summer of 1939, Leap had been on the run for nearly 2 years. The pressure on organized crime had reached a breaking point. Every speakeasy raid, every gambling den shutdown, every arrest of a low-level mobster was explained by authorities as part of the search for Lepke Buchalter. The commission was fed up. Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and other bosses had a problem. One man's runaway status was risking everyone's business. The longer Lep stayed in hiding, the more intense the heat became. And there was always the danger that Lep, feeling trapped, might decide to talk to the authorities and bring everyone down with him. A decision was made. Lep had to give himself up. But the commission needed to control the conditions of that surrender. They needed to make sure that Lep went into custody on federal charges, which would likely end in a fairly light sentence for drug trafficking, rather than state charges for murder, which could end in the electric chair. Albert Anastasia was chosen to give the message to Lep. Anastasia, who had protected Lep for 2 years, would now convince him that surrender was his only choice. But Anastasia would also lie to him a lie that would prove deadly. In August 1939, Albert Anastasia visited Lep at one of his safe houses in Brooklyn. What was said in that meeting has been put together from later speaking in court and from Lep's own bitter complaints after he realized he had been tricked. Anastasia explained the situation. The heat was unbearable. The pressure could not be kept up. Every day Lep stayed a runaway made things worse for everyone. But Anastasia had good news. A deal had been arranged. J. Edgar Hoover, Anastasia claimed, was willing to accept Leap's surrender on federal drug charges only. If Lep turned himself in, he would face federal court action, probably 5 to 10 years at most. The state charges would be quietly dropped or put off forever. Thomas Dewey would be kept out of it. Lep would serve some time in a federal prison, a fairly comfortable place, and then he would be let out, start his life again. It was, Anastasia promised him, the best deal possible under the conditions. There was even an element of drama to make it better. A famous newspaper writer named Walter Winchell had agreed to act as go-between. Winchell, who had millions of readers and great influence, would personally take Lep to J. Edgar Hoover. The whole thing would be handled quietly. With dignity. Lep was doubtful. He had survived this long by trusting no one. But Anastasia was convincing, and more importantly, Lep was tired. 2 years of living underground, of constant fear, of being alone from his family. It had worn him down. The promise of a fairly short federal sentence, followed by freedom, was tempting, and Lep had one more reason to believe the deal might be real. Several of his lawyers had also told him that a federal surrender might be possible, that Hoover was indeed willing to take custody of Lep on the drug charges alone. What Lep did not know, what Anastasia did not tell him, was that the moment he surrendered to federal authorities, he would also be open to state court action for murder. Thomas Dewey and New York authorities had every plan to take Lep to court for the Joseph Rosen killing and other murders. The deal was a made-up story, a lie designed to get Lep into custody, where he could not cause any more problems for the commission. On the evening of August 24th, 1939, Lepke Buchalter made his choice. He would surrender. The scene was planned for the most publicity. At 10:17 p.m. on that warm summer evening, a car pulled up to the corner of 5th Avenue and 29th Street in Manhattan. Inside were two men, Walter Winchell, the famous writer, and Louis Lepke Buchalter, the most wanted man in America. Waiting at the corner was another car. Inside sat J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with several FBI agents. Winchell had built his whole career on big news and dramatic stories, and this was the big news of a lifetime. He had been talking on his radio show for weeks, sending coded messages to Lep. "You can trust me. Come in, the deal is real." Now, as the moment arrived, Winchell could hardly hold his excitement. He got out of his car and walked to Hoover's vehicle. "Mr. Hoover," he said, "this is Lepke Buchalter." Lep came out from Winchell's car and slid into the back seat of Hoover's vehicle. He was well-dressed, clean-shaven, and amazingly calm for a man who had been living as a runaway for 2 years. He looked more like a businessman than a famous gangster. "How do you do?" Lep said politely to Hoover. Hoover, never one to miss a chance for good publicity, had arranged for photographers to capture the moment. The next day, newspapers across America would feature the story, "Public Enemy #1 surrenders to FBI director." For Hoover, it was a huge win, proof that the FBI could get anyone. For Lep, it was the beginning of the end. At FBI headquarters, Lep was processed on federal drug charges. He seemed relieved, almost relaxed. He had made the right choice, he told himself. A few years in federal prison, it was manageable. He would serve his time, and then he would return to his life, his wife, his business. But the next morning, the reality of his situation began to become clear. Thomas Dewey's office said that as soon as Lep's federal court action was finished, New York State would try to get him sent back to face murder charges. There was no deal. There had never been a deal. Lep had been tricked. When Lep realized what had happened, he reportedly said to his lawyer, "They sold me out. They told me it would be just federal time, but it was too late. He was in custody, and the wheels of justice, so long delayed, had finally begun to turn." Lep's federal trial for drug trafficking began in late November 1939. The government's case was strong. Many witnesses said in court that Lep had been involved in bringing heroin from Europe and giving it out in New York. The proof included letters that had been stopped, speaking from informants, and records showing big cash payments that could not be explained by legal business. Lep's defense plan was to argue that he was being aimed at because of his reputation, that the government was set to find him guilty of something, anything, because he was famous. His lawyers tried to cast doubt on the trustworthiness of the government's witnesses, many of whom were themselves criminals who had gotten deals in exchange for their speaking in court. But the jury was not convinced. On December 22, 1939, Lepp was found guilty on drug charges. He was sentenced on January 2, 1940 to 14 years in federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas. For a brief moment, Lepp may have hoped that this would be the end of it. 14 years was a long time, but it was not a death sentence. He would be in his early 60s when let out. Maybe he could still save something of his life. But even as Lepp was being taken to Leavenworth, events were happening in New York that would destroy any hope of living. In March 1940, police arrested several members of Murder, Inc. on different charges. Among those arrested was Abe "Kid Twist" Reels, one of the most productive killers in the organization. Police had been building a case against Reels and his partner Martin Bugsy Goldstein for the murder of a small-time hoodlum named Whitey Rudnick. The proof against Reels was strong, and both he and Goldstein knew they were likely facing the electric chair. But Reels had something the authorities wanted information. He had been present for dozens of murders. He knew how Murder, Inc. worked. He knew who gave the orders, who carried them out, and where the bodies were buried, literally. The Brooklyn District Attorney's Office, led by William O'Dwyer and his helper Burton Torkuz, made Reels an offer. "Tell us everything. Speak in court, and we will spare your life." For a man facing the electric chair, it was an easy choice. Reels agreed to work with them. What followed was one of the most amazing confessions in American criminal history. Reels had a memory like a photograph, and he used it to devastating effect. He described the murders in small detail. Who was killed? Why were they killed? Who ordered the killing? Who carried it out? What method was used? Where was the body put? He drew maps showing where bodies were buried. He gave dates, times, and places over several months. Reels described more than 80 murders he had either taken part in or had direct knowledge of. He involved dozens of members of Murder, Inc., including several men thought to be untouchable. And he directly involved Louis Lepke Buchalter in many murders, including the killing of Joseph Rosen. With Rellies' cooperation, Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer began a series of court actions that would effectively take apart Murder, Inc. The trials were shocking, controlling headlines for months. The first to go on trial were Rellies' former partners, Martin Bugsy, Goldstein, and Harry Happy Mayone. Even with their fearsome reputations, they seemed small and almost pitiful in the courtroom. Reels spoke in court against them, describing many murders they had done. The jury talked for less than 4 hours before coming back with guilty decisions. Both men were sentenced to death. Next came Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss, perhaps the most productive killer in Murder, Inc. Reels said in court that Strauss had personally taken part in over 100 murders. Strauss was found guilty and sentenced to death. Frank Dasher Abendando was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death, one by one. The killers who had frightened New York for a decade were found guilty and sentenced to die in the electric chair. And with each trial, Burton Torkuz built his name as the lawyer who had finally brought down Murder, Inc. But Torkuz had his sights set on bigger targets. He wanted the men who had ordered the murders, not just the men who had carried them out. He wanted the bosses. And the biggest target of all was Louis Lepke Buchalter. The challenge in taking Lepp to court was that he had been very careful to protect himself from direct part in murders. He rarely gave orders straight to the killers. He used go-betweens. He spoke in code, and he had killed many possible witnesses, but Reels gave the breakthrough. He said in court that he had been present when Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone talked about the Joseph Rosen murder, and they had clearly stated that the order had come from Lep. More importantly, Reels could describe the structure of Murder, Inc., and show how orders flowed from Lep down through the organization to the actual killers. Still, Turkus needed more. He needed someone who could speak in court about Lep's reason for ordering Rosen's death. He needed someone who knew Rosen personally and could explain why Lep saw him as a threat. That witness was Max Rubin. Rubin, the clothing district businessman who had been meeting with Rosen on the morning of the murder, was unwilling to speak in court. He knew what happened to people who spoke in court against Lep. But with Lep already in federal custody, with dozens of Murder, Inc. members under arrest or dead, the organization that had protected Lep was falling apart. Rubin was offered protection, and after much thinking, he agreed to speak in court. Rubin speaking in court would be important. He could explain Rosen's background, his troubles with Lep's trucking illegal business, his threats to talk to lawyers. He could give the background that explained why Lep had ordered the murder, with Reels and Rubin as witnesses. Turkus believed he had enough to find Lep guilty of first-degree murder, but there was one problem. Lep was in federal custody at Leavenworth, serving his drug sentence. To take him to court on state murder charges, New York would need to convince the federal government to turn him over. That process would take more than a year, during which time Lep would desperately try to avoid being sent back to New York from his cell at Leavenworth. Lep watched the destruction of Murder, Inc. with growing horror. Every newspaper brought news of another guilty decision, another death sentence, another former friend who was working with lawyers. The organization he had built so carefully was falling apart. Lep's lawyers fought desperately to stop his being sent to New York. They argued that he was serving a federal sentence and should not be turned over to state authorities. They argued that he would not get a fair trial because of the huge publicity surrounding the case. They argued that the state was doing double punishment by taking him to court for crimes he had already been sentenced for federally. Every argument was turned down. The federal courts ruled that New York had a right to take Lep to court for murder, and that this court action did not fight with his federal sentence. On May 9, 1941, Lep was officially moved from federal to New York State custody. He arrived at the Tombs, New York's famous city jail, to wait for trial. For the first time in years, he was back in New York, back where his crime career had begun. But now he was powerless, defenseless, and facing the very real chance of execution. The trial of Louis Lepke Buchalter, Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, and Louis Capone for the murder of Joseph Rosen began on October 14, 1941. The courtroom was packed with news people who were just curious, and family members of victims. Outside, crowds gathered, hoping to see the famous gangster. Burton Turkus led the court action. He was careful and thorough, building his case piece by piece. He started by showing who Joseph Rosen was: a truck driver, a businessman, a husband and father. He showed that Rosen had been forced out of the trucking business by Lep's organization. He showed that Rosen had been talking about his complaints, that he was a possible witness against Lep. Then Turkus called Max Rubin to the stand. Rubin was nervous. He knew that members of Lep's organization, who had not been arrested, might aim at him for speaking in court. But under Turkus's questioning, he described his relationship with Rosen, their meeting on the morning of the murder, and Rosen's statements about Lep. He was afraid, Rubin said in court. He said Lep had destroyed his business, that he had nothing left. But he also said he wasn't going to let Lep get away with it. He said if the district attorney ever asked him, he would tell everything he knew. The defense tried to shake Rubin speaking in court. suggesting he was lying to save himself or to collect a reward. But Rubin held firm. His speaking in court was believable and damning. Then Turcuz called his star witness, Abe, Kid Twist Reels. Reels took the stand on November 18, 1941. He was a small man, not impressive physically, but when he began to speak in court, the courtroom fell silent. For 3 days, Reels described the inside workings of Murder, Inc. He explained how jobs were given, how killers were chosen, how bodies were disposed of. He described dozens of murders in chilling detail, and he directly tied Leap to the Rosen murder. He said in court that Mendy Weiss had told him that Lepp had ordered the hit, that Rosen was talking too much and had to be silenced. He described how the murder had been planned, how the killers had been chosen, how they had waited outside Rosen's store that morning. The defense lawyers tried desperately to make Reels not believable. They pointed out that he was a confessed murderer who had been given safety in exchange for his speaking in court. They suggested he was lying to save his own skin. They attacked his character, his trustworthiness, his reasons. But Reels could not be shaken. His speaking in court was too detailed, too specific, too consistent to be made up. And the jury believed him. More witnesses spoke in court. Ali Tik-Tok Tannenbaum, another Murder, Inc. member who had turned informant, backed up parts of Relly's speaking in court. Sholem Bernstein, who had driven the killers to Rosen's store, spoke in court about the plan of the murder. The defense called character witnesses who said in court that Lepp was a family man, a good husband, a legal businessman. But these speaking in court sounded empty in the face of the huge proof of his part in murder. On November 30th, 1941, after 17 days of speaking in court, the case went to the jury. They talked for less than 12 hours. On December 2nd, 1941, the jury said its decision: guilty of first-degree murder. All three men, Lepp, Weiss, and Capone, were found guilty. Judge Franklin Taylor gave the sentence: death by electrocution. Lepp stood to hear the sentence, his face pale but composed. He had known this moment was coming, but the reality of it was still shocking. He was going to die. The state of New York was going to kill him. As he was led from the courtroom, Lepp looked at the crowd of people watching. Among them were relatives of Joseph Rosen, who had waited 5 years for justice. They showed no feeling as Lepp passed, but the message was clear. The bill had come due. Leap, Weiss, and Capone were taken to Sing Sing's death row, officially known as the condemned cells. It was a grim place, a block of 12 cells, each measuring 7 feet by 8 feet, containing only a bed, a sink, and a toilet. The cells faced the execution room, which the condemned men could see every time they left their cells for the short exercise times allowed them. Life on death row was a strange mix of boredom and terror. The days passed slowly, marked only by meals, exercise times, and visits from lawyers or family members. But hanging over everything was the knowledge that someday, maybe in weeks, maybe in months, maybe in years, each man would be led to the electric chair and killed. Lepp tried to keep his calm. He read a lot books, newspapers, magazines. He played cards with other condemned inmates during exercise times. He met regularly with his lawyers, who were making appeals, and he got visits from his wife Betty and his stepson Harold, visits that became more and more difficult as the reality of his situation became impossible to deny. Betty stayed loyal to the end. She visited regularly, bringing news from the outside world, offering what comfort she could. She never accepted that her husband was the monster shown in the newspapers. To her, he was still Lepp, still the man she had married. Still the stepfather who had loved Harold as his own son, Harold, now a young man, fought to match the father he knew with the man described in court. But he too stayed loyal, visiting regularly, trying to keep some connection to normal life in the middle of this nightmare. Meanwhile, Lep's lawyers made appeal after appeal. They argued that the trial had been unfair, that the jury had been prejudiced by publicity, that Reliz's speaking in court should not have been allowed, that the state had done wrong by the lawyer. Every argument was carefully looked into, passionately presented, and finally turned down. The New York Court of Appeals supported the guilty decision. The U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the case. One by one, every legal road was used up. As 1942 turned to 1943, and 1943 turned to 1944, it became clear that there would be no last-minute save. No dramatic change, no miracle. Louis Lepke Buchalter was going to die. On November 12, 1941, just days after speaking in court against Lepke, Abe Reels fell from a sixth-floor window of the Half Moon Hotel in Coney Island, where he was being held in protective custody. He fell 5 stories and died at once when he hit the ground below. The official explanation was that Reels had been trying to escape and had fallen while trying to climb down from his window using bed sheets tied together. But this explanation was met with wide doubt. Reels was scheduled to speak in court in another major trial, the murder trial of Albert Anastasia. His speaking in court could have brought down one of the most powerful mob bosses in America. Many believed that Reels had not fallen, but had been pushed, that corrupt police officers on the mob's payroll had killed him to stop him from speaking in court more. The newspapers called Reels the canary who could sing but couldn't fly. His death remains officially unsolved, though few people familiar with the case believe it was an accident. For Lepke, Reliz's death might have seemed like good news. With the lawyer's star witness dead, maybe the case against him would fall apart. Maybe his guilty decision would be overturned. But it was too late. Reels had already spoken in court at Lepke's trial. That speaking in court was on the record, and there were other witnesses, Tannenbaum, Bernstein, Rubin, who could back up the key facts. Reliz's death changed nothing for Lepke. As 1944 began, Lepke's choices had shrunk to almost nothing. His appeals in the state courts had failed. The Supreme Court had declined to hear his case. Only 2 possibilities remained: executive mercy from New York Governor Thomas E. Dewey, or a change of sentence from President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Strangely, the man who would decide Lepke's fate at the state level was Thomas E. Dewey, the same lawyer who had driven Lepke underground in 1937. Dewey had been elected governor of New York in 1942, riding a wave of popularity based in part on his name as the gangster who had taken down Lucky Luciano and helped bring down Lepke. Lepke's lawyers asked Dewey for mercy, arguing that the death penalty was too severe, that Lepke had not personally killed Joseph Rosen, that execution was not justice but revenge. Dewey looked at the request and said no. There would be no mercy from the state. The request to President Roosevelt was based on different grounds. Lepke's lawyers argued that he should be returned to federal custody to finish serving his drug sentence before being executed on state charges. They argued that the federal government had a prior claim on Lepke and that the state was breaking federal power by executing him. The request also included a more dramatic argument. Lepke, his lawyers hinted, had information about political corruption that could be of interest to federal authorities. If his life were spared, he might be willing to share this information. This was a dangerous game. For years, there had been stories that Lepke had dirt on many politicians, that he had records of bribes paid, favors exchanged, and crimes done by supposedly respectable public figures. Some believed that Lepp had been protecting powerful people by staying silent, and that if he decided to talk, it could bring down dozens of careers. Governor Dewey was reportedly worried about this possibility. He had no idea what Lepp might know about New York politics during the 1930s. If Lepp started talking, who knew what might be shown? But in the end, it did not matter. President Roosevelt, busy with World War II and having no special interest in the fate of a New York gangster, denied the request for a change. The federal government would not step in. The execution was planned for the week of March 2nd, 1944. In early March 1944, Lepp was moved from his regular cell to the pre-execution cell, located just steps from the death room. From this cell, he could hear the generators that powered the electric chair being tested. He could hear the guards making their preparations. He knew with complete surety that his time had run out. He was allowed more visiting rights in these final days. Betty came to see him almost every day. The visits were heartbreaking. After 13 years of marriage, they were about to be torn apart forever. Betty kept her calm during the visits, but guards reported that she would break down crying as soon as she left the prison. Harold, now 22 years old, also visited. The young man who had known Lepp as a father since childhood fought to find words. What do you say to a man who is about to die? Lepp met with his rabbi, who urged him to make peace with God and with himself. The rabbi asked Lepp if he wished to confess his wrongs, to admit the harm he had caused. Lepp listened politely, but said little. There were also visits from law enforcement officials, making one final try to get Lepp to talk. Brooklyn District Attorney William O'Dwyer came to death row, as did people from Governor Dewey's office. The message was the same. If Lepp would give information about political corruption, about other murders, about the operations of the mob, his sentence might be changed. This was Lepp's last card to play. For years, he had kept silent, had followed the gangster code of omerta silence. But now, with death very near, did that code still matter? Lepp reportedly came close to talking. He hinted that he had information, that he could show things that would shock the public. He dangled the possibility of cooperation like a lifeline, hoping for a save. But in the end, either Lepp decided that loyalty to the code was more important than life itself, or he realized that even if he talked, it would not save him. The authorities wanted information, but they also wanted justice. Joseph Rosen's murder was not going to be forgotten, no matter what Lepp might show. On March 2nd, 1944, Lepp got the news there would be no more stops. The execution would go on Saturday, March 4th at 11 p.m. He had 48 hours left to live. Saturday, March 4th, 1944, was a cold, clear night at Sing Sing prison. Inside the death house, 3 men waited for their meeting with the electric chair. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss, Louis Capone, and Louis Lepke Buchalter. The steps for executions at Sing Sing were well set. 3 men would die, one after the other, each execution taking only a few minutes. The order had been decided. Weiss would go first, then Capone, then Lepp. Through the day, the 3 men went through their final routines. They were offered special meals, the famous last meal that condemned prisoners are allowed to ask for. Lepp asked for a simple dinner. He ate little on it. They were allowed to write final letters. Lepp wrote to Betty and to Harold, saying his love and his regret that things had ended this way. The letters would be given after his death. They met with their religious advisors. Lepp spent time with his rabbi, doing quiet prayer, Whatever was said between them stayed private. At 10:30 p.m., the warden came to tell them that it was time. The three men were moved to the final holding cells, the dance hall, where they would wait until called. Witnesses had been gathering in the execution room since 10 o'clock p.m. by law. A certain number of witnesses were needed at every execution. People from the prison, law enforcement officials, news people, and sometimes relatives of the victim. On this night, about 30 people were present, sitting in wooden chairs arranged in rows, facing the electric chair itself, the electric chair at Sing Sing. Called Old Sparky, was a heavy wooden chair with leather straps to hold the prisoner. Electrodes would be attached to the prisoner's head and leg, and when the executioner pulled the switch, 2,000 volts would surge through his body 3 times, stopping the heart and destroying the brain. Death was usually instant, though sometimes a second or even third shock was needed. At 11:02 p.m., the green door to the execution room opened. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss entered. With guards on both sides, he was pale but walked firmly. He was led to the chair and strapped in. The leather mask was put over his face. The electrodes were attached. The witnesses sat in uncomfortable silence. Some moved nervously. Some looked away. Some stared hard, wanting to see justice done. At 11:04 p.m., the executioner, hidden behind a wall where the condemned could not see him, pulled the switch. Weiss's body went stiff as the current surged through it. After 3 separate shocks, the prison doctor looked at Weiss and said he was dead. His body was taken away, and the chair was made ready for the next execution. At 11:07 p.m., Louis Capone entered the room. He also walked firmly. Showing no outside sign of fear, he was strapped into the chair. The mask was put on, the electrodes attached. At 11:09 p.m., the switch was pulled. Capone's body shook. 3 shocks, the doctor's look, the saying of death, and then it was Lep's turn. At 11:13 p.m., Louis Lepke Buchalter was taken from the holding cell. He had been sitting quietly, his hands folded, his face blank. When the guards came for him, he stood without waiting. "It's time, Lep," the warden said. "I know," Lep answered. They walked the short distance from the holding cell to the execution room, maybe 30 feet, perhaps the longest walk of Lep's life. With each step, he moved closer to death, closer to the end of everything he had been, everything he had done, everything he might have become. The green door opened. Leap entered the room. He saw the witnesses sitting in their rows, their faces serious. He saw the electric chair, still warm from the earlier executions. He saw the guards waiting to strap him in. For 47 years, Louis Buchalter had lived. He had been a boy in the apartments of the Lower East Side. He had been a young criminal, learning his trade in the streets of New York. He had been a brilliant organizer building a crime empire. He had been a husband and stepfather. He had been feared and respected. He had made millions. He had ordered the deaths of dozens, perhaps hundreds of men, and now it had come to this. A wooden chair, leather straps, and 2,000 volts of electricity. Lep was guided to the chair. He sat down without fighting. The guards began strapping him in, straps around his chest. His arms, his legs, the holds were tight, keeping him unable to move. The warden came up and asked if Lep had any last words. Lep looked at the warden for a moment. He seemed about to speak. Perhaps he would finally confess, finally admit his crimes, finally say something about the men he had killed and the lives he had destroyed. But in the end, Leip simply said, "I have nothing to say." The leather mask was pulled over his face. Cutting off any further chance of speech, the electrode cap was placed on his head, wet sponges under it to make sure of good connection. Another electrode was attached to his right leg. The witnesses sat forward in their chairs, some sickly interested, some looking away. At 11:16 p.m., the executioner pulled the switch. 2,000 volts surged through Lepke's body. His fists clenched. His body went stiff against the holds. The smell of burning skin filled the room, the sure result of electricity passing through human tissue. The first shock lasted for about a minute. Then the current was lowered, then increased again for a second shock. And finally, a third shock shorter. Making sure that death was complete, at 11:18 p.m., the prison doctor looked at Lepke's body. He checked for a heartbeat, checked for breathing, checked for any signs of life. There were none. "I pronounce this man dead," the doctor said. Louis Lepke Buchalter, one of the most powerful gangsters in American history, was gone. In the history of American organized crime, dozens of powerful mob bosses have lived and died. Many died violently, shot down in the streets, killed in barbershops or restaurants, killed by rivals or by their own men. Others died peacefully in their beds, surrounded by family, having escaped justice for their whole lives. Meyer Lansky died in 1983 at age 80 in Miami Beach, having never spent a day in prison, even with decades of crime activity. Frank Costello died in 1973 at age 82 of a heart attack, having retired from mob life and lived his final years in relative peace. Carlo Gambino died in 1976 at age 74 of natural causes. Still the head of one of New York's 5 families, Vincent the Chin Gigante died in 2005 at age 77 in federal prison. But of natural causes, not execution. Even Lucky Luciano, who spent years in prison, was finally paroled and sent out of the country to Italy, where he lived until his death from a heart attack in 1962. But Louis Lepke Buchalter stands alone. He is the only major mob boss, the only member of the National Crime Syndicate's leadership ever to be executed by the government, not shot down in the street by rivals, not killed in prison by enemies, but legally executed after trial and guilty decision for murder. Why was Lepke the only one? Part of the answer lies in bad luck and bad timing. Lepke killed Joseph Rosen at exactly the wrong moment. Had he killed Rosen a few years earlier, before Thomas Dewey's fight against organized crime, the murder would likely have been unsolved like so many others. Had he killed Rosen a few years later, after the mob had learned to be more careful about killing witnesses, he might have avoided leaving the proof trail that led to his guilty decision. Part of the answer lies in the speaking in court of Abe Reels, without Reel's cooperation, without his memory like a photograph, and his willingness to describe murder, ink as operations in detail. Lawyers would have found it nearly impossible to connect Lepke to specific murders. Reels gave the key that opened the case. Part of the answer lies in the political climate of the late 1930s and early 1940s. Politicians and lawyers were under huge pressure to do something about organized crime. The public was angry about the extent of mob influence in American life. There was a political will to make an example of someone, and Lepke was the most famous target available. And part of the answer lies in Lepke's own wrong guesses. By going into hiding for 2 years, he made himself the subject of a huge manhunt that kept public attention focused on him. By ordering the deaths of so many possible witnesses, he made more proof of his willingness to kill to protect himself. By surrendering based on a promise that turned out to be false, he put himself in custody where he could be taken to court. But perhaps the deepest answer is that Lep represented something the American justice system needed to prove: that no one was above the law. He had been so powerful, so protected, so seemingly untouchable. He had corrupted industries, bought officials, and killed without punishment. If he could get away with it, if he could die peacefully of old age, what message would that send? The execution of Lepke Buchalter was a statement. Crime does not pay, the bill comes due. Justice, however delayed, will finally arrive. The execution of Lep was part of a larger taking apart of Murder, Inc., and the crime organizations that had controlled New York in the 1930s. Emmanuel Mendy Weiss and Louis Capone died with Lep on that March night in 1944. Their executions got far less publicity, overshadowed by the more famous Lep, but they too paid the final price for their crimes. Harry Pittsburgh Phil Strauss was executed on June 12, 1941, at Sing Sing. He went to the chair cursing and fighting, having to be held by force by guards. Even at the end, he stayed violent and not sorry. Martin, Bugsy, Goldstein, and Harry Mayoni were executed on February 19, 1942. Also at Sing Sing, both men had been found guilty of murder, based largely on Raley's speaking in court. Frank Dasher Abundando was executed on February 19, 1942, along with Goldstein and Mayoni. In his final days, he reportedly said he was sorry for his crimes, though whether this was real or a last-minute try to save himself is unclear. Albert Anastasia, the Lord High Executioner, survived the destruction of Murder, Inc., though he was charged with murder based on Raley's speaking in court. The case fell apart after Raley's mysterious death in 1941. Anastasia continued to be a powerful mob boss until October 25, 1957, when he was shot to death while sitting in a barber's chair at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Manhattan. His killers were never caught, but the murder is believed to have been ordered by rival mobsters who saw him as too violent and unstable. Meyer Lansky, Lep's friend and fellow member of the commission, had an amazing career. He became one of the most powerful figures in organized crime, with interests in casinos, drug trafficking, and many other illegal businesses. He lived until 1983. Dying of natural causes in Miami Beach, he was never found guilty of a major crime, though the government followed him for decades. His funeral was attended by only a handful of people. The old friends were mostly dead, and the new generation of mobsters barely remembered him. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who had worked with Lep in the early days, went west and helped build Las Vegas as a gambling center. He was shot to death in Beverly Hills on June 20, 1947, likely because his mob partners believed he was stealing from the casino operations he ran. Lucky Luciano, the man who had helped create the commission and who had worked next to Lep for years, spent the rest of his life in Italy after being sent out of the country. He died of a heart attack in 1962 at Naples Airport, reportedly on his way to meet a movie producer about making a film of his life. Thomas E. Dewey, the lawyer who had followed Lep so relentlessly, went on to become governor of New York. Serving from 1943 to 1954, he ran for president twice. In 1944 and 1948, losing both times, the 1948 loss to Harry Truman was one of the greatest surprises in American political history. Dewey lived until 1971, always proud of his part in bringing down organized crime in New York. Burton Turkus, the Helper District Attorney who took the Murder, Inc., Cases to Court, wrote a best-selling book about his experiences titled *Murder, Inc., The Story of the Syndicate *, published in 1951. The book became one of the most important sources of information about organized crime in the 1930s and 1940s. Turcuz later became a judge and continued to talk about the importance of fighting organized crime until his death in 1982. William O'Dwyer, the Brooklyn district attorney who watched over the court action of murder, Inc., was elected mayor of New York City in 1945. However, his time was marked by accusations that he had been soft on organized crime and had protected certain mob figures. He resigned in 1950 and was made U.S. ambassador to Mexico, where he served until 1952. Questions about his relationship with organized crime followed him for the rest of his life. Betty Buchalter never married again. After Lepke's execution, she lived quietly in New York, keeping contact with a few old friends, but largely moving away from public life. She worked different jobs to support herself and firmly refused to talk to reporters or writers who wanted to write about Lepke. In the few talks she did give, Betty said that Lepke had been a good husband and stepfather, that he had loved his family, and that whatever he had done in his business life was separate from the man she knew at home. She never fully accepted that the man described in the newspapers and in court, the cold-blooded killer who had ordered dozens of murders, was the same man she had married. Betty died in 1993 at the age of 89. Having outlived her husband by nearly 50 years, Harold Buchalter, Lepke's stepson, changed his name after the execution to distance himself from the famous gangster. He served in World War II, returned to civilian life, married, and had children of his own. He rarely talked about his stepfather and worked hard to build a normal life far from the shadow of organized crime. He died in the 1990s, having successfully kept his privacy for most of his life. The destruction of Murder, Inc. and the execution of Lepke had deep effects on organized crime in America. First, it showed that even the most powerful mob bosses were not untouchable. The myth of being unbreakable that had surrounded figures like Lepke was shattered. Lawyers had proven that with enough will, enough resources, and enough cooperation from witnesses, they could successfully take mob bosses to court for murder. Second, it showed the importance of witness protection. Ray Lee's speaking in court had been key to the guilty decisions, but his cooperation had only been possible because lawyers could offer him protection. However, not enough that protection finally proved to be. Future court actions of organized crime would depend heavily on informants, and witness protection programs would become more and more advanced. Third, it changed how the mob worked. After Lepke's execution, mob bosses became much more careful about protecting themselves from actual crimes. They used more layers of go-betweens. They avoided any part in planning or ordering specific murders. They learned from Lepke's mistakes. The rise of the so-called boss of all bosses ended with a generation that included Lepke. Future mob leaders would keep lower profiles. They would be less flashy, less visible, less likely to attract the kind of attention that had destroyed Lepke. Labor racketeering, Lepke's specialty, continued but changed. The mob continued to get into unions and to use them for forced payments and theft. But they did so more carefully, more quietly, with more attention to avoiding the kind of proof trail that had doomed Lepke. Perhaps most importantly, the destruction of Murder, Inc. marked the end of an era in American organized crime. The 1930s had been a golden age for the mob. Prohibition had made them rich. Prohibition's end had forced them to have different kinds of businesses, and by the mid-1930s, they had reached power and sophistication like never before. Murder, Inc. represented the peak of this era, a national organization that could kill anyone anywhere with professional exactness. But by the mid-1940s, This era was over. The mob would continue. It would change, adapt, and stay a powerful force in American society for decades. But it would never again reach the kind of concentrated, organized killing machine that Murder, Inc. represented. And it would never again produce a figure quite like Louis Buchalter. The story of Lepke Buchalter has interested Americans for decades, making books, movies, and television shows. The 1975 film, Lepke, starring Tony Curtis in the title role, tried to tell Lepke's story. The film focused on his rise to power and his final fall, though it took considerable freedoms with historical truth. Curtis played Lepke as more sympathetic than he actually was, suggesting that he was driven to crime by conditions rather than choice. The film was not a commercial success, perhaps because audiences in the 1970s were more interested in glamorous mob figures like The Godfather than in the more ordinary reality of labor racketeering. Lepke and Murder, Inc. have appeared in many other films and television shows as background parts. The HBO series Boardwalk Empire, which showed organized crime in the 1920s and 1930s, had characters based on Lepke and his friends. The show caught some of the complexity of the era, the ethnic tensions, the political corruption, the violence that lay under the surface of American life. Burton Turkis's book, Murder, Inc., remains the definite account from the time of the organization and the court actions that destroyed it. Written in 1951, when memories were still fresh and many of the people were still alive. The book gives priceless detail about how Murder, Inc. worked and how it was brought down. More recent books have looked at Lepke's life and career with the help of historical view. Historians have looked at his part in the development of organized crime, his business skill, and his final failure. Some have shown him as a crime genius whose organizational skills were corrupted by want and greed. Others have shown him simply as a thug who happened to be smart enough to build a large crime business. What lessons can we take from the life and death of Louis Buchalter? First, the lesson about power and its limits. Lepke reached amazing power for someone of his background. He rose from poverty to control whole industries. He commanded an army of killers. He had politicians and judges on his payroll. And yet, in the end, his power was not real. It depended on fear and violence. And when the state decided to destroy him, all his power counted for nothing. He died strapped to a wooden chair while workers pulled switches. Second, a lesson about violence. Lepke believed that violence was a tool that could solve problems. Someone threatening to talk? Kill him. Someone challenging your authority? Kill him. Someone in your way? Kill him. This method worked for years until suddenly it did not. The more people Lepke killed, the more proof he made against himself. Each murder was another witness, another investigation, another chance for something to go wrong. Violence, rather than protecting Lepke, finally destroyed him. Third, the lesson about loyalty. Lepke was proud of his loyalty to the code of omerta silence. He kept silent, even when cooperation might have saved his life. He did not tell on his fellow mobsters, even when they had betrayed him and sent him to his death. There is something almost noble about this. A criminal who kept faith with his own twisted code. But what did that loyalty get him? He died anyway. His loyalty meant nothing to the men who had betrayed him, meant nothing to the state that executed him, meant nothing in the end. Fourth, the lesson about being sure to happen. Lepke's death was not an accident or bad luck. It was sure to happen. From the moment he chose a crime life, from the moment he ordered his first murder, he set himself on a path that could only end badly. He might have died violently at the hands of rivals. He might have died in prison, or he might have died in the electric chair. But one way or another, the bill was going to come due. Crime might pay in the short term, but the long-term cost is always higher than the short-term gain. Fifth, the lesson about justice. The execution of Lep was just in the sense that he was guilty of the crimes for which he was found guilty and sentenced. He had ordered the murder of Joseph Rosen. He had ordered dozens of other murders. He had built an empire on violence and fear. He deserved punishment, and yet there is something troubling about Lep being the only major mob boss to be executed. Dozens of other bosses did crimes just as serious, killed just as many people, corrupted just as many organizations, and they died peacefully of old age. Was Lep really worse than Meyer Lansky, who built a crime empire that lasted decades? Was he worse than Albert Anastasia, who personally took part in dozens of murders? Was he worse than Lucky Luciano, who helped create the National Crime Syndicate? The truth is that Lep was not uniquely evil. He was just uniquely unlucky. He got caught at the wrong time by the wrong lawyers with the wrong witnesses against him. Justice was served in his case. But the fact that justice was so rarely served in similar cases raises uncomfortable questions about the American legal system's ability to truly deal with organized crime. In all the attention paid to Lepke Buchalter, his life, his crimes, his trial, his execution, it is easy to forget the man whose murder sent him to the electric chair, Joseph Rosen. Rosen was 43 years old when he died. He had come from Russia as a young man looking for chance in America. He had married, raised 4 children, and tried to build a small business. He was not a gangster, not a criminal, not someone involved in the underworld. He was just a truck driver trying to make a living. Lep destroyed Rosen's business because it was convenient, because Rosen was in the way of Lep's plan to control all clothing trucking. Then Lep killed Rosen because Rosen dared to complain, because Rosen was a possible witness, because Rosen's life meant nothing compared to Lep's interests. 17 bullets ended Joseph Rosen's life. His children grew up without a father. His wife became a widow. His small dreams of wealth, of security, of a better life for his family died with him on the floor of his candy store. The execution of Lepke Buchalter did not bring Joseph Rosen back. It did not undo the damage done to his family. It did not give back what was stolen. But it did send a message. Joseph Rosen's life mattered. His murder would not be forgotten. The powerful could not kill the powerless without punishment. In the end, perhaps that is the real meaning of Lep's execution. It was justice not just for the act of murder, but for the pride that made Lep believe he could commit murder without result. It was a statement that the life of a small candy store owner mattered as much as the life of a powerful gangster. Joseph Rosen deserves to be remembered not as a footnote to Lep's story, but as a victim who finally received justice, however delayed, however not perfect. It has been 80 years since Louis Buchalter walked to the electric chair at Sing Sing prison. In those 80 years, dozens of mob bosses have lived and died. Organized crime has changed, adapted, and in some ways, gone down from its peak in the mid-20th century. But no major mob boss has been executed since Lep. There have been guilty decisions, certainly. John Gotti died in prison, serving a life sentence. Vincent Gigante died in prison. Many capos and soldiers have been sentenced to death for murders done in the course of mob activity. But no one at Lep's level, no member of the National Crime Syndicate's leadership. No boss of a major family has faced execution. Why not? Part of the answer is that the death penalty itself has become more and more rare and argued about. Many states have gotten rid of it entirely. The Supreme Court put new limits on its use in the 1970s. Even in states that keep capital punishment, it is used sparingly and mainly for the most serious murder serial killers. Child murderers, mass murderers, but part of the answer is also that the mob learned from Lepke's example. Modern mob bosses are extremely careful about protecting themselves from actual crimes. They use multiple layers of go-betweens. They avoid direct part in violence. They structure their organizations to make court action as difficult as possible. When mob bosses are taken to court today, it is usually under RICO laws, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, passed in 1970, which lets lawyers aim at the whole organization rather than just individual crimes. Under RICO, bosses can be found guilty of planning and racketeering, even if they never personally did violence. But RICO guilty decisions usually carry life sentences, not death sentences, so Lepke stands alone, a warning story. A historical unusual event, the only mob boss to sit in the electric chair. His story reminds us that the American criminal justice system, for all its flaws and limits, can sometimes reach justice. It reminds us that power, however great, is not unlimited. It reminds us that the bill always comes due. And it reminds us that behind every mob story, every tale of crime, genius, and organized violence, there are victims, people like Joseph Rosen, whose only crime was being in the way, people whose names are forgotten as the criminals who killed them become famous. On that cold night in March 1944, when the switch was pulled and electricity surged through Lepke's body, justice was done. Not perfect justice, delayed justice. Justice that came too late for many of Lepke's victims, but justice nonetheless. And as the prison doctor said, Louis Lepke Buchalter dead, an era in American organized crime came to an end. The only mob boss to sit in the electric chair had paid the final price. The lights in Sing Sing burned a little brighter that night, powered by the generator that had just taken a life. And somewhere in Brooklyn, in a cemetery where Joseph Rosen had been buried 8 years earlier, perhaps there was a feeling that the universe had finally balanced its accounts. The story of Louis Lepke Buchalter is uniquely American. It is a story of immigration and opportunity, of poverty and want, of the dark side of the American dream. Lepke was a boy who came from nothing, who saw the lying and corruption around him, who decided that if the system was fixed, he would fix it in his favor. He was brilliant in his way. He understood organization, efficiency, and leverage. He could have been a successful legal businessman. He had the intelligence, the work habit, and the strategic vision. But he chose crime, and having chosen crime, he followed it with the same single-minded will that others might bring to building a company or running for office. He was also monstrous. He ordered the deaths of dozens, perhaps hundreds of people. He corrupted unions that were supposed to protect workers. He forced businesses to pay and stole from pension funds. He turned killing into an industry, creating Murder, Inc. as a service organization for the criminal underworld. And in the end, he paid the price, not the price that most mob bosses pay. Death at the hands of rivals or a quiet death in old age or endless years in prison. Lepke paid the final legal price, execution by the state, a planned ceremonial killing carried out in the name of justice. Was his execution just by the standards of the law? Certainly, he was guilty of the crimes for which he was found guilty. He received a fair trial with good lawyers before a fair jury. His appeals were heard and thought about. The sentence was carried out according to law. But justice is more than legal steps. Justice is about balance, about making sure that the guilty are punished and the innocent protected, about keeping a moral order in society by that standard. Lepke's execution represents only partial justice. Joseph Rosen got justice. But what about the dozens of other people Lepp killed, whose murders were never taken to court? What about the thousands of workers whose union dues Lepp stole? What about the businesses he destroyed and the lives he ruined? And what about all the other mob bosses who did similar crimes but never faced similar results? If Lepp deserved execution for ordering murders, didn't Meyer Lansky? Didn't Albert Anastasia? Didn't Lucky Luciano? Yet they lived free or died natural deaths. The inconsistency is troubling. Perhaps the best way to think about Lepp's execution is not as perfect justice, but as a symbolic statement. It was the American justice system's way of saying, we can get you, we can find you, take you to court, find you guilty, and execute you, no matter how powerful you are, no matter how well you hide, no matter how much you've corrupted our organizations. We can still bring you down. That statement was important in 1944, and it remains important today. Organized crime is still with us. Though in different forms, corruption is still with us. The temptation to believe that might makes right, that the powerful are above the law, that temptation is eternal. The execution of Lepke Buchalter reminds us that no one is above the law, that justice, however delayed, can still arrive. It reminds us that there are results for our choices, that the bill always comes due, and it reminds us that behind every crime, every act of violence, every wrong use of power, there are human victims, people with families and dreams and hopes for the future. People like Joseph Rosen, whose memory deserves to be honored. On March 4th, 1944, at 11:16 p.m., Louis Lepke Buchalter took his last breath. The story that had begun in the apartments of the Lower East Side 47 years earlier came to an end in a death room at Sing Sing. The only mob boss to sit in the electric chair was gone, but the story itself, the rise and fall, the brilliance and brutality, the power and the final powerlessness, that story lives on. It lives on as a reminder, as a warning, and as a proof of the complex relationship between crime, justice, and the American experience. Crime might pay in the short term, but the bill always comes due. Always. If you have made it this far through this deep look into history, thank you for taking this trip with me. Leave a comment and let me know what you thought of Lepke Buchalter's story. Did you know about him before this? What part of his life and crimes did you find most interesting or upsetting? And if you would like to see more long documentaries about forgotten or less-known figures from criminal history, let me know who you would like me to cover next. Should I look at labor racketeers? Or perhaps figures from different times or different types of organized crime? Do not forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these deep looks. Press that like button if you appreciate the research and detail that goes into these videos. There is always another story to tell, another life to look at, another piece of history to explore. Until next time, stay curious about history, even its darkest corners, because understanding how we got here, the good, the bad, and the monstrous helps us find our way to where we are going.